There is a fundamental lie at the very core of modern society. A lie so massive, so seamlessly integrated into the fabric of our daily lives that we accept it as an absolute truth. The lie is that the medical industry exists to heal you. It does not. Healing is a finite process. Healing has a definitive end, and in the world of venture capital and quarterly earnings, an end is the absolute worst-case scenario. A patient who is permanently cured is a customer who is permanently lost. The true purpose of the system is not to cure, it is to manage. It is to keep you just sick enough to remain entirely dependent, but just alive enough to keep paying the monthly subscription for your own survival. You did not understand this. You were young, you were an idealist. You were driven by the naive, foolish belief that you could actually save the world. You were the lead synthetic biologist at Thorne Medical, a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical conglomerate. You spent 6 years in a sterile, windowless sub-basement laboratory. You did not have a social life, you did not have a family. You had the hum of the centrifuges, the blue glow of the electron microscopes, and the endless, beautiful complexity of cellular mathematics. You were working on a project you quietly named the Lazarus strain. It was a synthetic macrophage, a microscopic, bioengineered hunter-killer. Current treatments for cellular degeneration and autoimmune diseases act like a bandage. They suppress the symptoms, they slow the decay. The Lazarus strain was different. It did not suppress, it eradicated. It was designed to enter the bloodstream, identify corrupt cellular structures, completely consume them, and force the body to regenerate perfect, healthy tissue. It was a reset button for the human immune system. It was a permanent single-dose cure. It was the holy grail of modern medicine. It was a Tuesday morning at 3:00 a.m. when the final long-term animal trials finished compiling. You sat in the cold, silent laboratory. You watched the data cascade across your monitors. A 100% efficacy rate, 0 cellular toxicity, complete, total eradication of the targeted diseases in every single test subject. You had done it. You had just rendered a $1 trillion global sickness industry completely obsolete. You picked up the secure phone on your desk. Your hands were shaking with pure adrenaline and joy. You called Dr. Elias Thorne. Elias was the founder and CEO of the company. He was your mentor, the man who plucked you out of a university lab when you were just a brilliant, broke graduate student. He had given you unlimited funding. He had treated you like the son he never had. You woke him up, you told him to come down to the sub-basement immediately. 20 minutes later, the heavy steel door of your lab slid open. Elias walked in. He was wearing an expensive cashmere overcoat over his pajamas. His silver hair was perfectly swept back. He stood behind your chair. He looked at the monitors. You explained the data. You explained that a single intravenous dose of the Lazarus strain permanently rewrote the cellular clock. You waited for him to celebrate. You waited for the champagne. You waited for him to tell you that you had just secured the Nobel Prize and changed the trajectory of human history. But Elias did not smile. The room was completely silent. You turned your chair around to look at him. The expression on his face was not joy, it was not pride. It was absolute freezing terror. He stared at the glowing green numbers on the screen. He slowly took off his glasses. He looked down at you, his eyes were completely cold. Do you have any idea what you have just done? He whispered. You smiled confused. I cured it, you said. We cured it, Elias. Elias slowly shook his head. You did not cure anything, he said. You just engineered the bankruptcy of my entire empire. He walked over to the main terminal. Thorne Medical makes $18 billion a year managing these diseases, he explained. We sell the treatments that keep these people alive month after month, year after year. He leaned over the desk, his face inches from yours. If we release a single-dose cure, our revenue stream drops to 0 overnight. Our stock collapses. The board of directors will have me crucified. You stared at him in absolute shock. The naivety was slowly draining out of your body, replaced by a cold, sickening realization. You told him you wouldn't let him bury it. You told him that millions of people were dying. You told him that if he didn't publish the findings, you would go to the press yourself. You threatened him. That was your first and most fatal mistake. Ilias sighed, a deep, heavy, theatrical sigh. He put his glasses back on. I am so sorry to hear that, he said softly. He pressed a button on his encrypted smartwatch. Before you could even stand up from your chair, the heavy steel door of the lab hissed open again. 3 men walked in. They were not security guards, they were large, broad-shouldered men wearing civilian clothes. They moved with absolute, silent precision. You stood up, you backed away from the desk. Ilias looked at you with an expression of deep, manufactured pity. The stress of the work has finally broken your mind, he said. It is a tragedy, a brilliant mind completely consumed by schizophrenic delusions. One of the men grabbed you from behind. His grip was like a steel vise. You tried to scream, you tried to fight. Another man stepped forward. He held a small, silver pneumatic syringe. He pressed it into the side of your neck. There was a sharp hiss of compressed air. A freezing chemical fire shot through your veins. The world instantly tilted on its axis. Your legs collapsed, the glowing monitors blurred into a sea of green light. The last thing you heard before the darkness completely swallowed you was the sound of Ilias typing on your keyboard. He was locking you out of your own system. He was deleting your administrative credentials. He was erasing your existence. You woke up to the smell of bleach and stale linen. You opened your eyes, the light was blindingly, painfully bright. You were strapped to a bed, heavy leather restraints locked your wrists and ankles to the steel frame. The walls were padded with thick white vinyl. There were no windows, there was no clock. There was a heavy steel door with a small, reinforced glass viewing port. You were in the Blackwood Psychiatric Institute. It was an elite, highly secretive private facility located deep in the mountains, funded almost entirely by dark money donations from Thorne Medical. It was where billionaires sent their problems to disappear. A doctor walked into the room. He did not look at you like a human being. He looked at you like a damaged piece of inventory. He held a clipboard. He informed you of your diagnosis. Severe paranoid schizophrenia, grandiose delusions, violent psychotic tendencies. You tried to speak, you tried to tell him about the Lazarus strain, you tried to tell him that Ilias Thorne had stolen your life's work. The doctor simply nodded, wrote something down on his clipboard, and adjusted your dosage. Every word you spoke in your defense only served as further medical evidence of your insanity. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. For the first 6 months you fought. You screamed until your throat bled. You thrashed against the leather restraints until your wrists were rubbed raw and infected. You demanded a phone call, you demanded a lawyer. They responded by injecting you with heavy, chemical sedatives, drugs designed to turn the human brain into thick, useless mud. You spent days staring blankly at the white ceiling, drooling, unable to form a coherent thought. You realized that fighting them physically was suicide. If you continued to struggle, they would simply chemically lobotomize you until you forgot your own name. So you stopped fighting. You completely changed your strategy. You became the perfect patient. You stopped talking about the medicine. You stopped mentioning Ilias Thorne. You stopped claiming you were a scientist. When they brought you the small paper cup filled with heavy antipsychotic pills, you smiled, thanked them, and put them in your mouth. But you did not swallow. You mastered the art of cheeking the medication. You hid the pills in the deep pockets of your gums. When the orderlies left the room, you would spit the dissolving chemicals into the toilet and flush them away. Slowly, agonizingly, your mind began to clear. The fog lifted, the sharp, brilliant edges of your intellect returned. But you did not let them see it. You maintained the facade, you shuffled your feet when you walked, you kept your eyes locked on the floor, you spoke in a slow, defeated monotone. You convinced them that you were entirely broken. You spent 3 years inside that white room. 3 years of absolute, crushing isolation. To prevent yourself from truly going insane, you built a massive, sprawling laboratory inside your own mind. You spent hours lying on your cot, staring at the blank wall, running complex biochemical equations in your head. You mapped out every single line of code in the Lazarus strain. You visualized the protein folding. You visualized the cellular interactions. You did not just preserve your knowledge, you expanded it. Without the distraction of the outside world, your focus became absolute. It became a laser. You evolved from a brilliant scientist into an apex intellectual predator. You realized that Elias had made one massive, arrogant miscalculation. He assumed that institutionalizing you would destroy you. He didn't realize that the isolation, the quiet, and the coldness of the facility were exactly the conditions required to forge a weapon. And you were that weapon. You just needed an opening. The opening came on a rainy Tuesday evening, exactly 3 years and 2 months after you were locked away. The facility was understaffed due to a severe storm knocking out the mountain roads. A new orderly was assigned to your wing. He was young, he was careless. He brought you your dinner tray. As he turned to leave, his foot caught on the edge of the heavy steel door. The locking mechanism did not engage. It was a microscopic human error, a gap of barely half an inch. But to you, it was the size of the Grand Canyon. You waited precisely 45 minutes until the night shift rotation began. You stood up, you walked to the door. You placed your fingers on the heavy steel, you pulled. The door glided open silently. You stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. You moved like a shadow. You had memorized the patrol routes of the guards by listening to their footsteps through your door for 3 years. You slipped past the nurse's station. You bypassed the main security checkpoint by crawling through the ceiling ventilation shafts, tearing your hands on the sheet metal. You reached the loading dock. You jumped into the back of a medical supply truck just as it was pulling out into the driving rain. You were out. You were free. You rode in the back of the truck for 4 hours until it reached the city. You jumped out into the cold, wet streets. You were wearing a thin, gray institutional uniform. You had no money. You had no identification. You walked through the neon-lit downtown district. You stopped at a massive intersection. You looked up and your heart stopped. There, glowing against the night sky, was a massive 10-story digital billboard. It was an advertisement for Thorne Medical. It featured a smiling family walking through a golden field of wheat. Above them, in massive white letters, was the name of a new drug. Eterna. The tagline read, "A lifetime of cellular stability." You stared at the chemical structure subtly displayed in the background of the advertisement. Your blood ran completely cold. Elias didn't bury the Lazarus strain. He weaponized it. You read the microscopic molecular chain on the billboard. Elias had taken your perfect cure, and he had deliberately crippled it. He had altered the synthetic macrophage. Instead of permanently resetting the immune system, he engineered it to die off after exactly 30 days. He had created a dependency loop. Eterna didn't cure the patient. It suspended the disease, but if the patient missed a single dose, the disease would return with twice the aggression. He had turned human health into a mandatory subscription service. And according to the ticker tape running beneath the billboard, Eterna cost $12,000 a month. Elias was making hundreds of billions of dollars. He had become one of the wealthiest men on the planet. He had built a golden empire on the back of your stolen, mutilated genius. Standing in the rain, looking up at his smiling face on the billboard, you did not feel anger. Anger is a hot, chaotic, useless emotion. You felt absolute, terrifying clarity. You were going to tear his empire down to the bedrock. You were going to salt the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. You vanished into the criminal underworld of the city. A man with your intellect does not stay poor for long. You used public library computers to quietly hack into secure, decentralized cryptocurrency exchanges. You siphoned off microscopic fractions of abandoned wallets, untraceable ghost money. Within a month, you had amassed $4 million. You rented an abandoned, subterranean meat packing facility on the industrial edge of the city. You paid entirely in cash. You began ordering highly specialized laboratory equipment through a complex web of dark web proxies and shell companies. Centrifuges, electron microscopes, massive servers, bioreactors. You built a state-of-the-art synthetic biology lab underground. You lived in the darkness. You did not see the sun for another entire year. You began to work. You did not need to recreate the Lazarus strain. You already knew how to do that. You needed to build a Trojan horse. Elias was manufacturing Eterna on a global scale. He had massive, fully automated bioprinting facilities on 3 continents. These facilities relied on a highly complex, centralized algorithm to perfectly sequence the proteins for millions of vials a day. You spent 6 months writing a single, devastating piece of malware. You called it the Genesis sequence. It was a biodigital hybrid virus. It was designed to infiltrate Thorne Medical's central manufacturing mainframe. Once inside, it would not destroy the servers, it would not halt production, that would be too obvious. Instead, the Genesis sequence would quietly, invisibly alter the protein folding algorithm used to create Eterna. It would correct the intentional flaw Elias had built into the drug. It would take the crippled monthly subscription version of the macrophage, and it would instantly revert it back into the true, permanent cure. The Lazarus strain. Elias' own factories would begin manufacturing the weapon that would destroy him, and he wouldn't even know it. It took you exactly 42 days to breach the outer firewalls of Thorne Medical. Elias had spent billions on cybersecurity. He had military-grade encryption. But a firewall is only as strong as the people monitoring it. And you knew how to exploit human laziness. You targeted a mid-level systems administrator in the European branch. You spent weeks digitally profiling him. You sent him a highly tailored, invisible phishing payload disguised as an internal memo from the HR department. He clicked the link. You were inside. You navigated the corporate labyrinth with terrifying speed. You slipped past the internal tripwires. You bypassed the secondary authentication protocols. You reached the absolute core of the global manufacturing grid. You uploaded the Genesis sequence. You watched the green confirmation text flash on your monitor in the dark, underground lab. Upload complete, protocol active. You leaned back in your chair. You had just pulled the trigger, the bullet was now flying through the air, all you had to do was wait for the impact. Across the globe, massive mechanical bioprinters quietly shifted their microscopic calibration. Millions of vials of Eterna were being filled, sealed, and shipped. But they no longer contained a 30-day treatment. They contained the permanent cure. Elias was shipping his own destruction to every hospital, pharmacy, and clinic on the planet. You did not stop there. Revenge is a highly specific mathematics. You wanted to destroy his legacy, but you also wanted to destroy his wealth. You set up a labyrinth of offshore brokerage accounts. You took the remaining $3 million you had amassed, and you leveraged it to the absolute maximum mathematical limit. You took a massive, catastrophic short position against Thorne Medical's stock. You were betting everything on the total collapse of the company. Now you simply had to wait for the world to notice. It took exactly 32 days for the first anomalies to appear. Eterna patients who went back to their doctors for their expensive monthly refills were given routine blood tests. The doctors stared at the results in absolute confusion. The patients were not just stable. They were completely miraculously cured. The disease markers were entirely gone. Their cellular structures had completely regenerated. They didn't need the refill. They didn't need the subscription. They were healed. Within a week, the isolated anomalies became a global medical phenomenon. Tens of thousands of patients were reporting spontaneous, permanent remission. Hospitals canceled massive orders of Eterna. Pharmacies sent shipments back. The news leaked to the medical journals, and then it exploded onto the mainstream media. Thorne Medical's miracle drug had somehow permanently cured the diseases it was only supposed to manage. To the public, it looked like the greatest medical miracle in human history. But on Wall Street, it looked like the apocalypse. The analysts ran the math. If Eterna permanently cured the patient, there was no recurring revenue. The company's entire financial model was built on lifelong dependence. Without that dependence, the company was worthless. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after you uploaded the Genesis sequence, the stock market opened. Thorne Medical's stock went into a violent, uncontrolled freefall. It dropped 40% in the first 10 minutes. Trading was halted. When it resumed, it dropped another 30%. Institutional investors panicked. They dumped millions of shares at any price they could get. The market capitalization of the company was vaporizing by the second. Billions of dollars entirely wiped off the ledger. You sat in your underground lab. Your monitors were a sea of violently red, downward-trending charts. But your personal brokerage account, the massive short position you had taken against Ilias, was climbing into the stratosphere. You were making tens of millions of dollars every single hour. You watched the television feed in the corner of your lab. Ilias Thorne was standing in front of a mob of frantic reporters outside his corporate headquarters. He looked terrified, his perfect hair was a mess, he was sweating. He was trying to assure the world that it was a manufacturing error, that they were looking into the glitch. He called the permanent cure a glitch. You took a sip of black coffee. It was time to end him. You initiated the final phase of the operation. You had maintained your backdoor access to the Thorne medical mainframe. You hacked into the building's central security architecture. You locked the heavy glass doors of the lobby, you disabled the elevators, you shut down the internal communication network. Ilias was trapped in his glass penthouse office on the 50th floor. He was completely cut off from the world. You activated the massive, high-definition monitor mounted on his office wall. In his office, Ilias spun around as the screen flickered to life. He did not see a video feed. He saw a live, scrolling readout of the original Lazarus strain clinical data. The data he tried to bury 3 years ago. Below the data, a live audio waveform appeared. You leaned into the microphone in your underground bunker. Your voice echoed through the speakers of his luxury office. "Hello, Ilias." Ilias staggered backward, he bumped into his heavy oak desk, the blood completely drained from his face. He recognized your voice instantly. He grabbed his phone, dead. He hit the intercom, dead. He was trapped in a cage of glass and steel. "It took you exactly 3 years to teach me how the world really works," you said calmly. Your voice was completely devoid of anger, it was terrifyingly calm. "You taught me that medicine is not about healing, it is about control." Ilias clutched the edge of his desk, he was shaking violently. "How did you get out?" he whispered. You ignored the question. "I just wanted to call and congratulate you, Ilias. You have successfully cured millions of people. You will go down in history as a savior." You paused, the silence in his office was suffocating. "Unfortunately," you continued, "saviors rarely die wealthy." You pressed a key on your terminal. The screen in Ilias' office shifted. It displayed his personal offshore bank accounts. Ilias gasped. You watched him through the security camera feed as he realized what you had done. When you initiated the short squeeze, you didn't just use your own money. You used his. You had hacked into his personal, highly encrypted Cayman Island trusts. You had taken his entire multi-billion-dollar personal fortune, and you had secretly leveraged it to heavily short his own company's stock. But you had done it on an illegal, unregulated margin exchange. As the stock collapsed, the margin calls triggered. Because the trade was inherently illegal and tied directly to his personal identity, the federal regulatory algorithms flagged it instantly. The SEC, the FBI, and Interpol were simultaneously freezing his assets worldwide. His wealth wasn't just gone, it was evidence of massive, global financial fraud. He was going to prison for the rest of his natural life. Ilias dropped to his knees on the expensive carpet. He was hyperventilating, he put his head in his hands and began to weep. The great visionary, the untouchable billionaire, reduced to a crying, broken animal in a matter of hours. You watched him cry. You did not feel pity. You did not feel satisfaction. You felt exactly what a surgeon feels when they successfully excise a malignant tumor from a patient. You had simply cut the cancer out of the world. "I left a single bottle of Eterna on your desk, Ilias," you said quietly. Ilias looked up. There, sitting on the polished mahogany, was a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. "It is the original formula, the 30-day subscription, the one you loved so much." You paused. "I also took the liberty of exposing your office ventilation system to a highly aggressive, synthetic autoimmune retrovirus I engineered yesterday." Ilias' eyes widened in absolute primal horror. He realized he was already breathing it in. Without that vial, your cellular structure will begin to collapse in approximately 48 hours, you explained. With the vial, you will survive for exactly 30 days. Then you will need another dose. But since your company is bankrupt and your accounts are frozen, you will have a very difficult time paying the $12,000 monthly subscription fee. Elias scrambled toward the desk. He grabbed the small glass vial. He clutched it to his chest like a drowning man holding a life preserver. Welcome to the medical system, Elias, you whispered. You reached out. You terminated the connection. The screen in his office went black. The power in his building was cut. You plunged him into total darkness. You sat back in your chair in the underground bunker. You looked around at the centrifuges, the servers, the quiet, humming machinery of your empire. They say that when you seek revenge, you should dig 2 graves. They are wrong. When you seek revenge, you do not dig graves, you build a new world on top of their ashes. You stood up, you put on your coat. You walked out of the laboratory and into the cold night air. The city was glowing in the distance. Millions of people were waking up, breathing easier, feeling a permanent cure flowing through their veins. You were not a hero, you were not a villain. You were the architect. And the architecture of the new world was finally yours to control.